The knock on the door came like a heartbeat in the dead of winter. 3 slow, deliberate thuds. Not the frantic pound of a man lost in the storm, but the patient, heavy knock of someone who knew you were home. Someone who knew you were alone. Delilah Moran froze. The tin cup in her hand trembled, spilling a drop of lukewarm water onto the rough plank floor. 6 winters she'd been up on this mountain. 6 winters of snow sealing her off from the world below, the world that had whispered her name into a curse and then forgotten her entirely. No one ever came up the winding path. In summer, it was a ghost trail. In winter, it was an impossibility. The fire in the hearth hissed, spitting a lone ember onto the stones. Outside, the wind didn't howl. It pressed against the cabin with a suffocating silence. Even the ancient pines seemed to be holding their breath. Another knock, this time just once, a summons. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the dead quiet. She set the cup down, her bare feet silent on the cold wood. She moved toward the door, her hand resting on the iron bolt she hadn't drawn in years. Who could it be? A hunter, horribly lost? A trapper who'd mistaken her light for a different camp? No. The knock was too certain. She slid the bolt. The wood groaned in protest. And just as her fingers touched the latch, a gust of wind tore through the chimney, sucking the air from the room, and the door swung inward on its own. He stood there, framed by the swirling white of the blizzard. A giant of a man, built of granite and hardship. Snow clung to his bare chest and broad shoulders, melting in patches against skin that seemed to radiate a feverish heat. His dark hair was plastered to his skull, his lips were blue with cold, but it was his eyes that stopped her dead. They were hollowed out, dark pits of exhaustion and desperation, and in his arms, wrapped in a crude burlap sling against his naked skin, was a child. A baby. The child let out a tiny whimpering cry, a sound no louder than a lost bird. The man didn't speak. He just stared at her, the storm raging behind him, as if he'd carried his last hope to her doorstep and was waiting to see if she would crush it. Delilah took a step back, her mind reeling. He blinked, shaking snow from his long lashes. "Can we stay?" His voice was a raw, broken thing, the voice of a man who had screamed into the wind until his throat was shredded. Just one night. Her eyes darted from his haunted face to the tiny bundle. A wisp of pale hair peeked out. The skin she could see was waxy, almost translucent. "You're both near frozen," she whispered, her voice tight. He gave a single, slow nod. He offered no explanation, no name, no story. She opened the door wider. He staggered inside, and the storm slammed the door shut behind him with a finality that felt like fate. She gestured to the worn chair by the fire, but he didn't move. He just stood there, dripping melted snow onto her floor, his gaze fixed on the flames as if he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. "Blanket," she muttered, more to herself than to him, already pulling a thick wool one from a nearby chest. The baby coughed. A high, wet, rattling sound that twisted something deep in Delilah's gut. That wasn't just a cold, that was something worse. She moved with a sudden urgency, taking the child from his arms before he could protest. The burlap was soaked, freezing to the touch. As she unwrapped the baby, her hands brushed against the man's chest. He was burning with fever, not warmth. Sickness. "Her name?" Delilah asked softly, cradling the impossibly light child. She felt a terrifying fragility in the tiny bones. He finally looked at her. "Mercy." "Yours?" she pressed. His jaw tightened. "She was my wife's. Now she's mine." Delilah didn't ask more, not yet. She carried the baby to the fire, her mind racing. She laid her gently in the old wooden cradle her father had carved for grandchildren that never came. A cradle that hadn't been rocked in almost a decade. The man watched her every move, his eyes unblinking. His hands hung at his sides, clenched into fists, as if he were fighting the urge to snatch the child back, or maybe fighting the memory of how he'd failed to protect her. "You're shirtless," Delilah stated, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. In a blizzard like this, it was a death sentence. Had to keep her warm, he rasped. My heat was all I had left. Delilah turned back to the hearth, her back to him. She didn't want him to see the conflict in her eyes. Pity fighting with a deep, primal suspicion. What's your name? He hesitated for a long moment. Bo. Bo what? Bo Ransom. She stirred the coals, adding another log. The flames leaped, casting dancing shadows across his weary face. He finally sank into the chair, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had finally been set down. For a long while, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the shallow, ragged breaths of the sleeping child. Delilah ladled broth into a cup and set it on the small table beside him. He rose slowly, took it in a hand that trembled slightly, and sipped. His whole body shook with the effort. The cabin, which for 6 years had smelled only of wood smoke, dust, and loneliness, now held something new. The scent of a storm, of another life, of a trouble so deep it had a smell of its own. He hadn't asked for anything but one night, but she knew better. Nothing that arrived in a storm ever stayed for just one night. Not blizzards, not grief, and not men with secrets burning behind their eyes. She studied him as he stared into the flames. A long, jagged scar ran from his collarbone down his ribs, disappearing beneath his belt. His knuckles were cracked and bloody. He kept glancing at the cradle, his jaw clenched, a raw terror in his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. This man hadn't come to take something from her. She saw that now. He had come to give away the very last thing he had, just to keep that child breathing. Delilah moved to the door and looked out the small window. The snow was a churning white fury. Trouble didn't always come with fists and fire. Sometimes it knocked politely, sometimes it came carrying a baby, and sometimes, against every instinct for survival, you opened the door anyway. She turned back inside. Bo had fallen asleep in the chair, his head slumped to one side, his hand still curled protectively toward the cradle. She didn't wake him. She moved to her own room, pulled the heavy quilt from her bed, and draped it over his shoulders. A gentleness she hadn't used in years. Then she lit a small oil lamp and placed it near the cradle. The baby, Mercy, stirred, a tiny frown creasing her brow, but she didn't cry. Delilah stood there for a long time, one hand resting on the carved wood of the cradle, anchoring herself. She whispered the child's name into the quiet room. Mercy. Then she went back to the main room, sat on the floor with her back against the door, and watched the storm rage outside. For the first time in 6 winters, the snow didn't feel like it was trying to bury her. It felt like it had brought her something. She just didn't know if it was a blessing or a curse. The storm lasted 3 more days. The snow piled in drifts so high they buried the windows on the north side of the cabin. The world was silent, white, and watchful. Bo didn't speak much, but he moved with a relentless purpose. Each morning before dawn, Delilah would watch from behind her curtain as he slipped out of the cabin, barefoot and shirtless despite the biting cold, and split wood. The axe rose and fell in a clean, sure rhythm, as if the physical labor was the only thing holding him together. He worked until sweat slicked his back, the snowflakes melting the instant they touched his feverish skin. He never asked to stay another day, and she never told him he could. But he did, and she let him. It wasn't trust. It was a kind of recognition. The shape of the sorrow he carried was one her own heart knew by feel. Mercy was the center of their silent world. The baby's dry, rattling coughs echoed in the small cabin, each one a blow to Delilah's chest. She worked tirelessly, boiling herbs, crushing pine needles into poultices, whispering the old remedies her mother had taught her. Prayers she hadn't spoken since she was a girl came unbidden to her lips. Bo never asked how she knew what to do. He just watched. His face, which seemed carved from harsh stone, would soften when he looked at Delilah tending to his daughter. On the second night, he finally spoke more than 2 words. She's getting better. Delilah didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. Hope, when spoken aloud, had a habit of turning to ash in her mouth. You always carry her like that, wrapped tight against your chest? She cries if I don't, he said, his voice low. Can't stand blankets on her. Remembers the water. Delilah's hand stilled. She turned slowly. Bo stared into the fire, his eyes seeing something far away. The river, it rose too fast, took the wagon. My wife. He looked down at his own empty hands. I pulled Mercy from her arms. Couldn't pull her out, too. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the ghosts of unspoken words. Delilah turned back to the stew. The scent of onion and sage filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold grief that had just settled in the room. You're lucky she's alive, Delilah said softly. Bo gave a single, bitter nod. Ain't sure I am. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't tell him not to speak that way. Some wounds were too deep for platitudes. They only needed a witness. She ladled stew into 2 bowls and set one on the table beside him. That night, she found him fixing the loose hinge on the pantry door, using a small knife and a bit of leather cord. He hadn't asked. He just saw what was broken and fixed it. I didn't plant anything this year, she said, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorframe. You will next year, Bo said, not looking up from his work. A small, sharp breath escaped her. You planning on staying that long? He finally met her gaze. His eyes were clear, direct. No, ma'am, but I figure someone ought to make it easier for you to stay. She had no answer for that, but she found herself watching his hands, broad, calloused, yet surprisingly gentle as they worked the leather. These were hands that had built things and broken things, and were now trying to mend whatever they could. Late the next afternoon, it happened. A sound so unexpected, it felt like a miracle. Mercy laughed. Delilah was holding her, walking her by the one clear window, pointing out a brave bluebird on a snow-laden pine. The baby reached out a tiny, clumsy hand, clapped twice, and let out a bubbling, gurgling laugh. It was a sound so pure, so full of life, Delilah felt tears spring to her eyes. Bo, who had been sanding a rough spot on the cradle, froze. He looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and raw, unguarded joy. Delilah turned, holding Mercy close, and met his gaze. No words passed between them. Just the echo of that tiny laugh, hanging in the air like a promise. That evening, something shifted. Delilah found herself brushing her hair, really brushing it, for the first time in months. She sat before the small, cracked mirror her mother had left her, letting the long, dark strands fall over her shoulders. The scar on her back, a pale, puckered line from what the town called her riding accident, peeked out from the collar of her nightgown. For the first time, she didn't try to hide it. Bo knocked softly on her doorframe. Need anything? She turned, not flinching as his eyes fell on the scar. He didn't look away in pity or disgust. He just looked. That happened young? He asked, his voice gentle. 17. He nodded once. Still beautiful. The words were plain, simple, said with the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used to say the sky was blue. It knocked the air from her lungs. You shouldn't say things like that, she whispered. Why not? Because I might believe you. He stepped further into the room, Mercy cradled in his arms, her eyes already heavy with sleep. Then maybe you should. I'm not looking for a man, she said, her voice stronger now. I'm not looking to be one, he countered. I'm just a man who owes you a debt. They stood in the flickering lamplight, the space between them charged with unspoken things. I know what they say about me in town, she said finally, a challenge in her voice. I don't care what they say. I do, she whispered, the old shame a bitter taste in her mouth. Bo adjusted the sleeping child on his chest. Then let me help you carry it. He looked at her then, really looked at her, at the strength in her jaw, the sorrow in her eyes, the resilience that held her together like wire. They call you cursed, but when I look at you, all I see is the woman who saved my daughter. He stepped closer, and Delilah didn't back away. She reached out, her fingers tracing the jagged scar on his chest. It was old, deep. A burn, maybe. "What happened here?" she asked. His eyes clouded over. "A fire. Long ago. I pulled someone out." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He was a man who ran into burning buildings, who stood shirtless in blizzards, who put others before himself. That night, when she tucked Mercy into the cradle, she placed her own favorite quilt over the sleeping child. The one she'd stitched together piece by piece, dreaming of a baby of her own. And when Bo settled into the chair by the fire, she brought him a pillow from her own bed. She didn't say a word. He just nodded his thanks. Later, as the moon rose over the silent, snow-covered world, Delilah stood at the window. The reflection showed a woman she barely recognized. Beside her stood the reflection of a man. They weren't broken things anymore. They were two solitary people who had, against all odds, found a fragile warmth in the heart of a winter storm. But as she watched the sleeping baby, a cold dread began to creep in. Mercy's breathing was still too shallow. Her skin, though warmer, still had a pale, waxy sheen. The herbs were helping, but they weren't curing. This wasn't a simple sickness from the river. It was something else. Something that clung to the child like a shroud. Something that felt deliberate. She looked from the peaceful baby to the sleeping man. He'd told her his wife had drowned. He'd told her he'd pulled Mercy from her arms. But what if he hadn't told her everything? What if the danger wasn't just the river they'd left behind, but something that had followed them here? Something he was terrified to name. The snow finally began to recede, melting in dirty rivers down the mountainside. The path to town became a treacherous ribbon of mud and ice. And with the thaw came a new kind of chill. Bo knew they needed more than herbs. Mercy's fever would break, only to return a day later, a persistent, clinging sickness that defied all of Delilah's remedies. He needed real medicine, and there was only one place to get it. "I have to go to town," he announced one morning, his voice grim. Delilah's hands stilled over the dough she was kneading. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "They'll see you. They'll see the baby. She needs a doctor's poultice, things you can't make here." He was already saddling the old mule Delilah kept in the lean-to. "I'll be back before nightfall." He wrapped Mercy in every blanket they owned, tucking her deep inside his coat until only the top of her little head was visible. He looked like a man heading into battle, not to the general store. Delilah watched from the porch, a knot of ice in her stomach. She watched him disappear into the trees, and the silence he left behind was louder than any storm. In town, it happened exactly as she'd feared. The moment Bo rode down the muddy main street, a hush fell over the handful of people out and about. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in windows. He was a spectacle. The giant, scarred man riding a borrowed mule, with a hidden bundle clutched to his chest. Mrs. Ida Crowley, the town's self-appointed moral compass, stood on the steps of the mercantile, her lips pursed into a tight knot of disapproval. "Well, I'll be," she muttered, loud enough for the wind to carry. "It's him, the one staying with the Marin girl." Deputy Lyle Varn, a man whose authority came more from the size of his gut than the shine on his badge, straightened up from his lean against a post. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud, his eyes narrowing on Bo. Bo ignored them all. He tied the mule and walked straight into the apothecary, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a shrill jingle. Inside, the clerk, a young man named Ilias, who had once been sweet on Delilah before the town turned on her, stared at him with wide, fearful eyes. "I need peppermint bark, mustard seed, and pine resin," Bo said, his voice low and even. As Elias nervously measured out the herbs, Mercy let out a weak cough from inside Bo's coat. Every head in the small shop turned. The silence was thick with suspicion. "That the child?" Elias whispered, his eyes flicking towards Bo's chest. Bo nodded once. You're staying up there? With her?" Elias asked, his voice a mix of awe and accusation. "She's the only reason this child is still breathing," Bo said, his voice like flint. He paid for the medicine, turned, and walked out without another word, the eyes of the entire town following him like vultures. Back at the cabin, Delilah scrubbed the floor with a furious energy, trying to scour away the anxiety that was eating her alive. When Beau finally returned at dusk, his face was a grim, unreadable mask. He said nothing of the town, just placed the small parcel of medicines on the table. But Delilah knew. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he avoided her eyes. The whispers had begun, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that they wouldn't stop until they had destroyed the fragile peace they had built. The next day, it started. 3 riders passed by the turnoff to her cabin, slowing just long enough to stare, their faces hard with judgment. One of them, a boy she'd known since he was in diapers, spat in the direction of her gate. By the end of the week, the mail wagon stopped coming. A bolt of cotton she'd ordered for a new dress for Mercy never arrived. The world was closing in, building a wall of silence and contempt around them. Beau saw it all. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. The easy way he'd started to move around the cabin was gone, replaced by a tense watchfulness. "You want me gone?" he asked one evening. They were standing on the porch, watching the stars appear in the cold, clear sky. The question hung between them, heavy and sharp. "They want you gone," he added, his voice rough. Delilah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They wanted me gone long before you ever came." He turned to look at her, his silhouette dark against the fading light. "Then why did you take me in?" "Because Mercy needed help," she said simply. But they both knew it was more than that. The words hung in the air, unsaid. "Because you looked as lost as I felt." "I can leave," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Take Mercy. Head south. They'll leave you be then." "And leave me with all this talk to make it look like every word they said was true?" She shot back, a flash of her old fire in her eyes. "I don't care what they think of me," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "But I hate what they're doing to you. I've lived with their lies for 6 years, Beau. They don't scare me anymore." He stepped closer, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "I don't want to be a weight on you, Delilah." "You're not a weight," she said, her voice softening. "You're a mirror." He looked confused. "A mirror?" She nodded, turning to face him fully. "They look at you, standing in my doorway, and it reminds them of every time they walked by and never knocked, every time they saw a woman hurting and chose to look away. Your presence here doesn't condemn me. It condemns them." He was silent for a long moment, processing her words. Then, a tiny cry came from inside the cabin. "Mercy." Delilah didn't move. "I'm not ashamed of you, Beau Ransom." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. A weight lifted from his shoulders. But just as a fragile hope began to bloom between them, Delilah's eyes fell on the package of medicine from town. She had been grinding the herbs, preparing a new poultice. As she worked, she'd noticed something. The peppermint bark was fine. The mustard seed was pungent. But the pine resin, it wasn't right. It was too dark, too sticky. And it had a faint, almost sweet smell that was sickeningly familiar. A smell that transported her back 6 years, to a dark night, a fall from her horse, and a searing pain in her back. A pain that had been followed by weeks of fever and a lingering sickness the doctor couldn't explain. A sickness that felt exactly like Mercy's. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a curse. It wasn't an illness from the river. It was poison. And the man who had sold it to Beau, the clerk Elias, was the nephew of the town preacher. Reverend Blackwood, the same man whose son had courted her, promised her the world, and then abandoned her after her accident. The same man who had been the first to call her cursed. It was all connected. Her past and Beau's present were 2 ends of the same terrible rope, and it was tightening around their necks. "Beau," she said, her voice shaking as she turned back to him, "we have a much bigger problem than gossip." "What do you mean?" Beau asked, his brow furrowed in confusion as he followed her back inside. Delilah didn't answer. She moved to the table, her hands trembling as she pointed to the small pile of dark, sticky resin. This is what you bought in town? Yes, pine resin. The clerk, Elias, said it was the strongest they had. Elias Blackwood? She asked, her voice sharp. Bo nodded slowly. Yes, I think that was his name. Why? Delilah sank into a chair, her face pale. Because his uncle is Reverend Blackwood, and this isn't pine resin, it's nightshade pitch. It's a slow-acting poison. Given in small doses, it mimics a wasting sickness. It causes fever, a cough, weakness. It makes the victim look cursed. Bo stared at her, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. Poison? No? Why would anyone? To get what they want, Delilah finished for him, her voice a dead whisper. She looked at the sleeping baby in the cradle, a terrible understanding dawning in her eyes. They're not trying to kill her, Bo. Not yet. They're trying to make her seem sickly, cursed. They want an excuse to take her away from you. The blood drained from Bo's face. He looked like he'd been struck. My wife's family, the Blackwoods, they never approved of me. Her father is the Reverend. He said I was ungodly, that I'd led his daughter, Ruthie, astray. He stumbled back, his hand gripping the edge of the table for support. When Mercy was born, they said she was born of sin, that she carried a stain. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They didn't want you to have her, Delilah whispered. They never did. After Ruthie died, Bo's voice broke. The Reverend said I wasn't fit, that I couldn't protect her. He tried to take Mercy then, but I ran. I just ran. Delilah stood up and walked to the hearth. She stared into the flames, her own past swirling in her mind. 6 years ago, I was supposed to marry the Reverend's son, Jonathan, she said, her voice hollow. I thought he loved me. But I overheard something, a conversation between him and his father, about their business. About moving goods through the territory that weren't on any manifest. About silencing people who ask too many questions. She turned to face Bo, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. Jonathan found out I knew. He took me for a ride that evening up near the ridge. He said he had a surprise for me. Then he pushed me. My horse bolted. I fell. My back was broken, but that wasn't the worst of it. The sickness that followed. It was this. The same poison. They wanted to discredit me, make me seem unstable, crazy, cursed, so no one would ever believe the word of a fallen woman. Bo stared at her, his mind reeling. The scar on her back wasn't from an accident. It was an attempted murder. Her isolation wasn't by choice. It was a prison sentence handed down by the same man who was now trying to steal his daughter. My God, he breathed. Ruthie. On the last day, before the river. She was weak, feverish. I thought it was just exhaustion. His eyes widened in dawning horror. They were poisoning her too, weren't they? Delilah could only nod, her throat tight. They hadn't just let their daughter drown. They had set the stage for it. They had weakened her, ensuring she wouldn't survive, leaving Bo to take the blame. It was a plan of unimaginable cruelty. Before the water took her, Bo said, his voice thick with a new, terrible grief. She made me promise something. She said, if anything happens, go to the mountain. Find the woman they call cursed. Only she can help you. I didn't understand. I just thought she was delirious from the cold. He looked at Delilah, his eyes filled with a new understanding. Awe. She sent me to you. She knew. She knew you were the only one who had ever stood up to them and survived. They stood in the silent cabin, the weight of this revelation settling over them. They were not two strangers brought together by a storm. They were two survivors of the same enemy, brought together by a dead woman's last, desperate hope. They know you're here, Delilah said, her mind racing. That clerk, Elias, he didn't just sell you poison. He confirmed your location. They know Mercy is with me. Then they'll be coming, Bo said, his voice low and dangerous. The grief in his eyes was being replaced by a cold, hard rage. Yes, Delilah said, but this time we're not going to run. She walked to a small locked chest in the corner of the room, a chest she hadn't opened in 6 years. She produced a small iron key from a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. She opened the chest. Inside, nestled amongst dried herbs and old letters, was a small leather-bound journal. "What's that?" Bo asked. "My mother was an herbalist. She taught me everything she knew," Delilah said, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "She also taught me that for every poison in the forest, the gods provide an antidote nearby." She flipped through the brittle pages, her eyes scanning the familiar script. "They thought they were being clever, using nightshade. It's hard to detect. But my mother, she knew things the Blackwoods could never imagine." She stopped at a page, a detailed drawing of a small white flower with a distinct purple center. "Wolfsbane aconite," she whispered. "But it's not wolfsbane, it's its cousin, white monkshood. It grows only on the north face of the highest peaks, in the deepest snow. It's rare, dangerous to find, but a single crushed petal steeped in hot water is the antidote." She looked up at Bo, her eyes clear and determined. "They think they have us trapped. They think this mountain is my prison. But they're wrong. This mountain," she said, a fierce smile touching her lips for the first time, "is my fortress." And they just marched their army right up to the gate. A new energy crackled in the small cabin. The fear was still there, but now it was forged into a weapon. They were no longer victims waiting for the end. They were fighters. "They will send the deputy first," Bo reasoned, his mind already working. "Varn. He'll come with some official paper, try to take Mercy legally. And when that doesn't work, the Reverend himself will come," Delilah added. "He won't be able to stand the thought of us defying him. He'll want to do it himself." "We need to be ready," Bo said. "I need that flower," Delilah stated. "I can keep the poison at bay with other herbs, but I can't cure her without it, and you can't go looking for it. They'll be watching the trails." A grim look passed between them. They were in a siege. Bo was the guardian, the shield. Delilah was the healer, the strategist. And in the cradle between them lay the tiny, innocent life they had both sworn to protect. "They think I'm a cursed, broken woman," Delilah said, her voice filled with a strength Bo had never heard before. "And they think you're a simple, grieving widower." She looked at him, a glint of steel in her eyes. They're about to find out how wrong they are. The next few days were a blur of tense, watchful preparation. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the trees, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They were prisoners in their own sanctuary. Delilah worked relentlessly, using her mother's journal to concoct teas and poultices that fought the poison's effects. She forced Mercy to drink a bitter brew of dandelion root and burdock, which made the baby cry, but also brought a faint touch of pink back to her cheeks. It was a holding action, a desperate battle to keep the darkness at bay. Bo became a silent sentinel. He reinforced the door, boarded up the north-facing window, and spent hours on the porch, axe in hand, his gaze constantly scanning the tree line. The easygoing man who had fixed her fence was gone, replaced by a warrior protecting his territory. The town's silence grew louder, more menacing. It was clear the order had come down from Reverend Blackwood. They were to be completely isolated. Cut off. Left to wither. But something else was happening too. In the crucible of their shared danger, the space between Bo and Delilah shrank. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a fluid dance of two people united in a single purpose. A shared glance across the room could convey a whole conversation. A light touch on the arm was a promise of solidarity. One night, exhausted and frayed, Delilah fell asleep in the chair by the fire, her head slumped over her mother's journal. She woke with a start to find that Bo had draped his own coat over her shoulders and was sitting on the floor by her feet, his back against the chair, keeping watch. Mercy was sleeping soundly in his lap. He didn't say anything. He just gave her a small, tired smile. In that moment, Delilah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope. "We need a plan," she said, her voice hoarse from sleep. "We can't just wait for them to come." "I know," Bo said. "But they have the town. They have the law on their side. Deputy Varn will use any excuse." "Then we don't give him one," Delilah said, an idea taking shape in her mind. It was risky. It was bold. It was probably insane. "We use their own weapons against them, their judgment, their self-righteousness." She looked at him. "Founders' Day is in 2 days." Bo stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "The town market?" "Delilah, that's the last place we should go. It's a trap." "Exactly," she said, her eyes alight with a feverish intensity. "It's the one place the Reverend would never expect us to go. It's public. There will be witnesses from all over the county, not just his flock. He can't make a move there without showing his true colors to everyone." "They'll tear you apart with their words," Bo argued, his protective instincts flaring. "Let them," she countered. "We're not going there to fight, Bo. We're going there to be seen as a family, a man, a woman, and a child. Something so simple, so normal, it will make their accusations of curses and sin look ridiculous." It was a brilliant, terrifying gamble. They would walk directly into the lion's den, armed with nothing but their own quiet dignity. "And while they're all distracted," Delilah added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "watching us, judging us, you're going to slip away." Bo's eyes widened. "And go where?" "To the North Peak, to get the monk's hood." The audacity of it left him speechless. It was a two-pronged attack, one of social defiance and one of desperate, life-saving action. "They'll follow me," he said. "No, they won't," Delilah insisted. "They'll be watching me, and Mercy. I'll be the lightning rod. I'll draw all their fire. You have to be fast. You have to get back before they realize what's happened." For a long moment, Bo was silent. He looked at Delilah, at the fierce determination in her face. He looked down at Mercy, sleeping peacefully against his chest. He was being asked to leave them, to walk into the heart of the enemy's territory. But he knew she was right. It was their only chance. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "We do it your way." The morning of Founders' Day dawned bright and clear. The air was crisp, carrying the distant sounds of fiddle music and laughter from the town below. It felt like the world was celebrating, oblivious to the life and death struggle about to unfold. They dressed with deliberate care. Delilah wore a simple indigo dress, the one she hadn't worn in years. She braided her hair neatly, her hands steady. She looked not like a recluse, but a homesteader, a mother. Bo wore his clean vest, but as they had planned, no shirt beneath it. The long, jagged scars on his chest and ribs were on full display, a silent testament to the fires he had walked through. He was not hiding who he was. Delilah wrapped Mercy in the quilt she had made and stitched a small sprig of rosemary to her bonnet for protection. She looked at Bo, her heart in her throat. "Ready?" she asked. He took a deep breath and gave a single, determined nod. "Let's go show them what a curse really looks like." They walked down the mountain, not as victims, but as a family heading to a festival. But as they neared the town, the happy sounds of the market felt less like a celebration and more like the roar of the arena. They were Christians, walking toward the lions. And Delilah, for the first time in her life, was not afraid. She was the one who had set the trap. The moment they stepped onto the main street, a wave of silence spread outwards from them, killing the music and laughter in its path. It was as if they had brought the mountain's chill with them. Every head turned, conversations died, fiddles went quiet. The entire town stopped to stare. Delilah kept her chin high, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the heat of their hatred. Mrs. Crowley, holding court near a cake stand, gasped dramatically and clutched her pearls. Men who had known Delilah's father turned their backs. Women pulled their children closer, as if a sickness walked among them. But Delilah did not falter. She walked with a serene calm, her hand resting lightly on Bo's arm. Bo, towering over everyone, his scarred chest a bold statement of defiance, met every hostile stare with a cold, level gaze. They were an island of defiance in a sea of condemnation. Just as they planned, Deputy Varn swaggered over, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his face flushed with self-importance. "Well, well," he sneered, blocking their path. "Look what the storm blew in. I thought you two had better sense than to show your faces here." "We came for the market, Deputy," Delilah said, her voice clear and steady, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Just like everyone else." "This market is for decent, God-fearing folk," Varn spat, his eyes flicking to Beau's bare chest with disgust. "Not for your kind." He then looked at Mercy, bundled in her quilt. "And there are laws about the proper care of children. A child needs a stable home. A Christian home. This was it. The opening move. "My home is stable, Deputy," Delilah said calmly. "And this child is loved. That's more than some can say." Varn's face turned a darker shade of red. He was losing control of the narrative in front of an audience. "This man has no claim here," he boomed. "He has no people, no papers. He's a vagrant. And you," he jabbed a fat finger at Delilah, "you've taken him in, against all decency." From the corner of her eye, Delilah saw Beau give her the slightest nod. It was time. While all eyes were on her and the deputy, Beau had to move. "This man," Delilah said, her voice ringing out across the silent square, "saved a child's life. He came to my door in a blizzard, half dead himself, and his only concern was for his daughter. If that's not decency, Deputy, then I don't know what is." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of the faces, the ones on the edges who weren't in the Reverend's inner circle, held a flicker of uncertainty. They had heard the whispers, the condemnation. But seeing them now, seeing this proud, defiant woman and the silent, protective giant at her side, the story was more complicated. "He is nothing!" Varn roared. "A nameless drifter!" And then Beau moved, but not in the way anyone expected. He didn't slip away into the crowd. He did the opposite. He handed the bundled Mercy carefully to Delilah. Then he took a step forward and knelt in the dirt. Right there, in the middle of the Founders' Day market, in front of the entire town, Beau Ransom went down on one knee. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Deputy Varn was struck dumb, his mouth hanging open. Beau looked up, not at the deputy, not at the crowd, but at Delilah. His eyes were filled with a raw, powerful emotion that silenced every whisper, every judgment. "I got nothing," Beau said, his voice rough but carrying in the sudden stillness. "I got no land, no gold, no name worth knowing. All I got is a daughter who breathes because of you, and a heart that started beating again the day I saw you." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, simple, and scratched band of silver. His wife's wedding ring. "They say I have no claim here," he said, holding the ring up. "So I'm making one." He looked directly into Delilah's eyes. "Delilah Marin, you are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known. You took in a storm and gave it shelter. Will you marry me? Will you let me build a life with you right here, on this mountain they all ran from?" Tears streamed down Delilah's face, but she was smiling. It wasn't a proposal born of strategy or defiance. It was real. It was a truth so powerful it shattered the lies that had imprisoned her for years. "Get up, you fool," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't you kneel to these people." "I'm not kneeling to them," Beau said, his voice unwavering. "I'm kneeling to you." She reached down, her hand covering his, and in that moment she didn't care about the plan, about the mountain, about the poison. She only cared about the man in front of her. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Beau Ransom, I'll marry you." A cheer went up, not from everyone, but from a surprising number. The farmers on the edge of the crowd, the blacksmith's wife, the quiet people who understood hardship and recognized courage when they saw it. Beau slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood up, and Delilah, still holding Mercy, stepped forward and kissed him. A real kiss, full of love and promise and defiance, right there in front of God and everyone. And just as their lips met, a cold, booming voice cut through the air. "Blasphemy!" The crowd parted. Standing there, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury, was Reverend Blackwood himself. He was flanked by his son Jonathan and two other grim-faced men. "This is a mockery of all that is holy!" the Reverend declared, his voice ringing with authority. "A union between a cursed woman and a godless vagrant! It will not stand!" He pointed a trembling finger at them. "That child is in danger. Deputy, I demand you take the infant into protective custody, for her own soul." The trap had been sprung, but the bait had just changed. Delilah pulled back from Beau, her eyes locking with the Reverend's. The smile was gone from her face, replaced by a look of cold, hard steel. "You want to talk about souls, Reverend?" she said, her voice dangerously quiet. She shifted Mercy in her arms, and with her newly ringed hand, she reached back and pulled down the collar of her dress, exposing the pale, puckered scar on her back for the entire town to see. "Let's talk about the soul of a man who would have his own son push a 17-year-old girl off a cliff to silence her," Delilah announced, her voice rising with power. "Let's talk about the soul of a man who uses poison to mimic a curse, first on me and now on this innocent child." She held up her hand, the silver ring glinting in the sun. "This man, Beau Ransom, is not a vagrant. He is the father of Mercy Ransom. And I," she declared, her voice echoing through the stunned silence, "am his wife. This is my husband. This is my child. And if you want her, Reverend, you'll have to come through me. And I promise you, you don't have enough prayers to survive that." The showdown had begun, not on the mountain, but right here, in the heart of the town that had condemned her. And Delilah Marine was no longer running. She was fighting back. A stunned, deathly silence fell over the town square. Reverend Blackwood's face, which had been flushed with righteous fury, turned a pasty white. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, given weight by the angry red scar Delilah displayed for all to see. "Lies!" the Reverend sputtered, his voice losing its booming authority. "The desperate lies of a fallen woman. She fell from her horse. It was an accident." "Was it an accident, Jonathan?" Delilah asked, her eyes finding the Reverend's son in the crowd. Jonathan Blackwood, the man who had once whispered promises to her in the moonlight, shrank back, his face a mask of guilt and terror. He couldn't meet her gaze. That single moment of cowardice was all the proof the town needed. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, no longer one of judgment against Delilah, but of dawning horror directed at their spiritual leader. "And what about the poison, Reverend?" Delilah pressed, her voice like ice. "The same nightshade pitch you used on me 6 years ago. The same sickness. Was that an accident too? Did you accidentally send your nephew Elias to sell it to Beau, telling him it was medicine?" Elias, who was standing near the back of the crowd, looked like he was about to faint. Beau stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Delilah's shoulder. He was no longer just a kneeling suitor. He was a husband defending his wife. His presence was a silent, powerful anchor to her words. "You wanted my daughter," Beau said, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver through the crowd. "You told me I was unfit. You tried to poison her, to make her look weak so you could steal her from me. Just like you tried to poison your own daughter, Ruthie, before the river took her." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was a sin beyond comprehension. Mrs. Crowley, who had been the loudest of Blackwood's supporters, looked utterly horrified, her hand flying to her mouth. "This is madness!" Blackwood shrieked, his composure shattering completely. "He's a murderer! He let my daughter drown!" "No," came a quiet voice from the crowd. An old man, a farmer named Silas, who rarely spoke a word, stepped forward. "I was down by the river that day," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "I saw the whole thing. The water was a rage. He fought like a demon to save them both. He came up with the baby in his arms, screaming his wife's name. A man who let his wife drown don't scream like that." The dam of lies broke. One by one, other voices joined in. He fixed my fence, another farmer said. Didn't ask for a thing in return. She gave my boy some herbs for his cough last winter, a woman added, pointing at Delilah. Never said a word about payment. The narrative, so carefully controlled by Blackwood for years, was unraveling in a matter of minutes. The townspeople were looking at Beau and Delilah not as a curse, but as neighbors. As good people who had been wronged by a man they had trusted implicitly. Deputy Varn, seeing the tide turn so violently, began to backpedal. He held up his hands, looking nervously between the furious crowd and the crumbling reverend. Now hold on. This is a civil matter. This is a matter of justice, Lyle, the blacksmith roared, stepping forward, his massive arms crossed. And it seems to me we've been listening to the wrong preacher. Reverend Blackwood saw it was over. His power, built on a foundation of fear and lies, had crumbled to dust. He gave one last hateful glare at Delilah and Beau, then turned and pushed his way through the crowd that now shrank back from him in disgust. He and his sons scurried away like rats fleeing a burning barn. In the sudden quiet, Delilah looked at Beau. He was already looking at her, his eyes filled with a love and admiration so profound it took her breath away. He gently touched the ring on her finger. She had done it. She had faced her monster and won, not with violence, but with truth. And then she remembered. The plan. The monk's hood. Her eyes widened in panic. Beau! The flower! He gave her a slow, secret smile. He reached into the inner pocket of his vest and pulled out a single, perfect white flower with a delicate purple center. She stared at him, dumbfounded. But how? When? When I knelt, he whispered, for her ears only. Everyone was watching you. No one saw me reach into the saddlebag of that farmer next to me. He winked. Silas. Turns out he's a bit of an herbalist himself. He'd just come down from the North Peak this morning. Said he had a feeling someone might be in need of it. Delilah stared from the flower to the old farmer, who simply tipped his hat to her from across the square. He'd known. Somehow he'd known. The mountain had provided. Tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming love flooded her eyes. She leaned her head against Beau's strong chest, the sleeping Mercy tucked safely between them, and laughed. A real, free, joyful laugh that echoed through the town square. The curse was broken. Not just the poison, but the 6 long years of loneliness and shame. The snow had melted. The winter was finally over. They didn't stay for the rest of the market. They walked back up the mountain, hand in hand, the silver ring on Delilah's finger catching the afternoon sun. They didn't look back. That night, Delilah steeped the petals of the monk's hood flower and gave the antidote to Mercy. The baby drank it down, and for the first time, slept a deep, peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. When she woke the next morning, her eyes were bright, her cough was gone, and her skin was the perfect pink of a sunrise. A few weeks later, beneath the old pine tree at the edge of her property, they were officially married by a traveling justice who asked no questions. The entire town, it seemed, came to watch. They brought pies and fresh bread, bolts of cotton and jars of jam. They brought their apologies not in words, but in offerings. Mrs. Crowley even brought a hand-stitched blanket for Mercy, her eyes full of a shame she couldn't quite voice. Delilah stood beside her husband, her daughter in her arms, and looked out at the faces of the people who had once shunned her. They were smiling. They were celebrating her. She thought about that first night, the terrifying knock on the door in the middle of the blizzard. She had almost not opened it. She had almost let the fear win. But she had opened the door to a storm and in doing so had let in the sun. Love, she had learned, doesn't always arrive quietly. Sometimes it comes half frozen and bleeding, with a baby in its arms and a blizzard at its back. Sometimes it's a terrifying, life-altering thing that asks for everything you have. But sometimes, if you're brave enough to let it in, it saves you. They say the woman on the mountain took in a stranger. But that was never the real story. The truth was much simpler. They took each other in, and they built a life so strong, no storm could ever shake it. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of opening the door to the unexpected, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You never know what story will come knocking next.